We have one of the best in the business here tonight. Before we get to a very special guest, let me introduce my faithful co-host and our head of scouting here at the Dynasty Rankings. We got our very own Nate Christian. Nate, good evening.
Good evening, Mike. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for who we have on tonight. I'm very excited because he's been a leader in this space for a while and someone I've been looking up to for about a decade now.
Well, we have Matt Waldman on the program today. Matt, how are we?
We're doing pretty well, and I feel special, even if that special may be it could be a pejorative term with me sometimes. So, but I certainly appreciate you guys having me on. It's an honor.
But we're almost getting into scouting. We started really early last year. I don't think we're starting as early this year, but we're going to have some fantastic prospects broken down on this channel. And for more, the guys that you don't hear, we do a lot of the big names here. But if you want that good stuff, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Who better to talk to about scouting than the master, Matt Waldman? So, Matt, before we get into it, I have one question. Did you have any formative training in this? Did you sit down with any scouts, or did you just kind of figure it out on your own there?
So I would say that from a football perspective, I had no formative training. From an operational perspective of how to create an evaluation process, I had probably about 15 years worth of training as an operations manager and a quality director, studying what really are the best practices for evaluating performance. Mm-hmm. And then I just ended up applying it to my love of football. And that process really helped me because it was rooted in ideas of how do you continue to grow? How do you define things in a manner that you can continue to get better at the subject that you're evaluating? And so that worked out really well. And I think in hindsight, when I look back at when I started back in, I started publishing it in 2006, the rookie scouting portfolio. But when the year and a half, 2 years before that, when I was really thinking about how I was going to do this, in hindsight, I look back, and especially from feedback I've gotten from scouts and people who work in the league, who have said to me, the process was way ahead of what you see or what we see that's normally known as the NFL process. And a lot of that's because they made up theirs as they went along. They were football people who were strong in football, but they didn't have operations training. I had more operations, business operations and quality control type of training. Being able to do quality management and business operations management for a while, that really, and getting exposed to some things that I had to get certified in, that my company would have to pay a fair amount of money to have me do, and then implement that on a management level and see how it succeeded, where there were areas that you could tweak it, I think really helped me as being my own, implementing it for myself and growing within a completely different subject.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So like compared to football stadiums, they had Lambeau. They were building it brick by brick over the years, and they had something nice together. But you're over here with Jerry World.
It's cool. It's funny. It's just funny how it works. I mean, you don't know how it's going to be when you get started. You just try and, for me, I'm fortunate to have been able to build a business doing this. And I think a lot of it is being able to blend my experience as a fantasy writer and starting up at the time that I did, where fantasy just really started to get hot on the internet. I was there just before that wave really started to crest. And that helped get my name out there. And on top of it, I was growing as a scout and developing that as that wave was cresting. So I think that was right place at right time, along with some hard work.
It's always good to be ahead of the curve too. I mean, there's a lot of, and a lot of people, sometimes they come to me for advice, say, I'm thinking about starting a podcast or doing this or that, but the market's so saturated. My advice is always do it. If you think your voice is different, you have something to add to the conversation, then do it. I mean, I'll be honest with you guys, and everybody out there listening and watching, I didn't think this podcast was going to survive COVID. You had so many people that started a podcast, our downloads just absolutely plummeted, but look, we stuck with it. And we came out on top, and those little startup podcasts, they're not with us anymore. So that's part of the process too, is just, you have to think ahead when you're scouting. And for me, when it's scouting, I look at it from a practical, what can they do on the field? And then I apply it to fantasy. That's how I kind of go about things. Matt, walk me through your process. How do you start? Is it just like a name? Do you see a box score and somebody that stands out and you're like, I need to look at this guy? Maybe you look at some game logs, like, all right, he's been doing this consistently for a while against good competition. Just walk me through it. How do you start with a player?
Sure. And for me, part of my process, I have to go back to starting with the actual process of how I evaluate any player, which
Okay.
is consistently putting forth having defined criteria of what it is that I'm looking for at each position. So like each position, I specialize in the fantasy positions for offense. So each position checklist that I have has anywhere between about 70 to over 100 points of criteria that are actually defined in writing and weighted in value. And it's done on a 100-point scale. So I'm consistently, as you can see in the background, taking notes of things that I may implement a year, 2 or 3 years later, as I'm kind of testing some things while I'm doing work that I'm publishing out there, so that I'm not testing on the final product at that time and going, well, I'm going to try this year. I'm going to try that in the background. But reading coaching manuals, reading, and not coaching manuals on X's and O's. X's and O's is a great silo that lends towards studying the game, but coaching manuals on positions, like how Jay Norvell at Colorado State, who used to coach all the Oklahoma receivers that came out and all the Indianapolis Colts receivers like Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne, how he teaches releases off the line of scrimmage, or Drew Lieberman and his work at Sideline Hustle and defining all of that. But then once I'm always tweaking that and taking notes of it. So that's continuous. And then I'm implementing some things over the summer. And then when it comes to players, I will get lists like like many of the draft guides or many of the college football guides that you see, out there. Phil Steele's is obviously a great resource that all media use, and I'll get those. I have some friends in the industry who will give me some lists of things that are kind of their own first look at players across the board that I can go off of and look. And then even something like Lindy's, I'll get a look at those guys too. So what happens is I will try and scout seniors first. I will try to wait on quarterbacks until probably around this time of the year. And just because I like to study quarterbacks and do at least 3 to 4 games in a row and then maybe revisit them again. But I'd rather have a wealth of games that have already been played to see what's going on with them, because it is a position of a high amount of variables that you got to look at. So I'd rather wait. But then I usually watch running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends during the summer. I'll look at seniors first, or players that have such a high profile that I'm pretty sure that they're going to come out that year and have a good feeling about that. And I usually watch anywhere between, 2 to 4 games to start with. And then I'll watch maybe another 2 to 4 games, maybe more in a second run when I look at those guys. So I'll try and get through about 50 to 60 players by like October. Try to get to, probably 90 to 100 players by the end of this month. And then finish up when I'm not doing fantasy football. After that, I can finish up with the remaining 50 or so players that I'll look at between then and early March. So as I'm watching players, I usually focus on one player at a time. I used to do maybe multiple players at a time, but I find that just emotionally, it feels tough to watch like a quarterback, both 2 wide receivers and a tight end in one game, because it feels like I'm never going to be done.
It's like watching that 2020 LSU team. You could watch any player on that team.
You could, and you would spend probably 2 days to finish one game if you're doing it, in a lot of detail, like the way I have this checklist and I'm looking through. So I'm looking at that. And if I notice players, I write them down and say, I noticed something that caught my eye, and I look up on the list to see if there are anybody that people have mentioned. If not, I'll write them down and add them to a spreadsheet of like players that I have listed that I want to watch. So I add them to that list. At the same time too, when it comes to studying them, with each of the positions that I study, I have, the checklist that I talk about that's in a yes or no format. And if it's a yes, it's a weighted value that comes with it. If I haven't seen it yet, it's marked no, because I've learned that if you just put not applicable, you have to decide whether you're going to give them the points or not. And I decided to approach it from the philosophy it's best to say the player has to prove that he's done the thing that you want to see, as opposed to assume that he can do it. That helps me so that maybe towards the end of my evaluation process time, that window of time before I start to write the book, I look back and look at things like, well, what are things that I haven't seen yet? Then I can go back and instead of watch another 5 or 6 games to look for this thing and study each thing on the checklist, I can watch those 5 or 6 games just looking for these 5 or 6 things that I haven't seen and see if I've seen them repeatedly in that span of games. And that way I can either know, well, I've only seen this once in like 6 games in one play, or I've seen him do this 5 times in one game because they schemed him differently and he had the opportunity to do it. That tells me there's some consistency with his game. So I take notes, I write up my reports while I'm watching the player and checking things off. With certain players like running backs and quarterbacks, I actually track my own charting of things. So like for quarterbacks, I literally have a matrix of literally like what I look at for quarterbacks is a matrix to look at their accuracy. Everything's graded in terms of, did they have the right amount of velocity for the throw? Was the throw pinpoint accurate by the Bill Walsh definition of like, is it where it's supposed to be based on the route and the location of the defender? Or is it area code accuracy, or what I call general accuracy, which is it's catchable, but it's more that the throw wasn't optimally placed based on what you want for the NFL relative to those conditions. And for I grade that for throws against zone, against man, and then for regions of the field, like certain short in the middle of the field, short in the flats, short in the sidelines, and then same with intermediate, vertical, and deep, which are 14-yard increments from where the quarterback throws it, not necessarily from the line of scrimmage. And I track all of that on every game that I watch for quarterbacks, and then I basically add. I have that added up on a spreadsheet so that I can show you the percentages relative to, say, like NFL Next Gen Stats do. When they show like what's the average completion percentage for certain distances and certain types of throws. And so I show that relative to that projected percentage so that you kind of get to see that. And I do the same thing with running backs in a way in terms of how they're breaking tackles. So because like when you look at some of the stat services that are out there and they do great work, but one of the things that can be missing is, again, they know football, but do they know operational processes? And when you think of like, a good example is like Saquon Barkley is a great running back. And I'm not just saying that because Mike's wearing a Penn State t-shirt, sweatshirt, but Saquon Barkley is a great running back. But are we getting an accurate picture of his yards after contact when someone slaps his thigh pad as he's running past them, and they give him credit for an 80 yards after contact, as opposed to someone like Nick Chubb, who I don't have my Georgia shirt on, but as a Georgia alum, I would say, as opposed to that, Nick Chubb, basically getting hit in the backfield by a defensive tackle and dragging him 8 yards. Which one is a more worthwhile depiction of yards after contact? They're both great backs, but which one is more about power in that, if you're weighing it that way? So I break out things like whether it's a hit, a reach, a wrap, who's doing the hit, reaching, and wrapping. And so that way you can kind of judge that too. And so I combine all of these factors. These are things I'm tracking when I'm watching tape. So that's really what my process looks like in terms of just watching players and going about it.
I have a question first off the back. How long does it take you to scout one player?
For now, like, for instance, I watched 4 games of Jake Haener yesterday, and that started, say, like at 1:00 in the afternoon, and I got done with other things that I had to do in between, or taking some breaks. I got done at about 2:00 in the morning yesterday. So it took all day to study one player. And I find that when I don't have things to do, what quarterbacks can take usually all day to scout like a few games. Wide receivers and running backs, I can usually do 2 or 3 in a day, depending on what I've seen and how much I've seen.
When you say you watch a game, you watch an entire game, or do you have, so you'll watch the broadcast version of that?
I used to watch, when I got started, I watched broadcast. Then when YouTube came along, I watched cut-ups of every play.
Right.
So I still tape broadcasts because it's always worthwhile to make sure that I have a library of games. Because I don't ever want to have any resource that I have that provides me coaches tape to say, hey man, our relationship to be able to give you that information is over. We're sorry, no hard feelings, but we just can't do that anymore. And then I'm going, well, I can't watch anybody because I didn't tape anything. So, or if YouTube just decides someday that unilaterally they're going to take away everything off of YouTube,
Well, that would suck for us.
it would be awful, right?
Yeah,
The idea of scary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as someone who's making a living doing this full time as an independent scout, I mean, if that happened, I would have to lean on others or just really hope. And while right now I'm able to use a resource where I'm getting a chance to watch, coaches tape on a regular basis, and their cut ups, and it saves a lot of time. If that day I still I literally have hard drives that are attached to my Direct TV. I still have Direct TV because they get the most amount of games. So I attach a hard drive to a 7 terabit hard drive to the TV and tape everything possible, and probably go through 2 to 3 of those hard drives every year, and save them. And if just in case,
that I'll tell you what, that's something. I wish I had the time to be that thorough. I try to be as thorough as I can. Usually, like today at lunch, I was scouting players because I'm trying to get ahead. So I was watching some Mohamed Ibrahim film. So I just go on YouTube and type in Minnesota offense verse. I try to see everything. Are they blocking? Does he run any routes? Newsflash. He's not going to be heralded as a great receiving running back, I don't think.
No.
It looked very unnatural to me. But that's really, that's the best I can do, to be honest.
But that's good.
Yeah.
And I did that for years. And
right.
that's something that, I still lean on. If there's a lot of times that there's tape I can't get a hold of with FCS guys, like Tyler Badgett, I think that's how you pronounce his name, from Shepherd, who's the quarterback. Yep. He's going to the Senior Bowl. I have no tape on him from the sources that I will use. And I don't know if I have any tape on him. Probably not from broadcast. So I'm just hoping that YouTube will have some of these games, and I'll be watching those games just like you in that same way.
One thing I respect about you is you have your process. You stick to it. I'm sure you will happily admit when you're wrong, as Nate and I, we own our mistakes. But what I've noticed about you is you do not subject yourself to narratives. You say, this is my guy. He's my number one. I'll give everybody out there an example. You were really high on Skylar Thompson this past season. So can you tell me what would put a player like Skylar Thompson above other quarterbacks that declared for the draft as well? What did you see in his game?
Yeah, well, part of it too is that the luxury that I've been able to build, because my vision for this was I wanted to study tape and I wanted to avoid the narrative thinking, because after my first year of doing this, and relative to where I am now, I knew nothing. So my first year, I remember studying a running back out of Arizona by the name of Mike Bell. Mike Bell, he was okay considered as a prospect, but he wasn't going to be on any top 10 lists at the position. But I think he was 5th or 6th or 7th on my board after I watched him. And I thought, well, whatever. What do I know? I'm an aspiring fantasy writer who's in his first year trying to scout players. And 2 years ago, I remember trying to scout Steven Jackson on my couch, with a beer in my hand and a notebook, watching TV, and waking up 3 hours later as he had had a huge game, hadn't recorded anything, and my cat's on my chest, as I, and the notebook somewhere, off on the floor. For me, watching, studying players, I realized that after watching Mike Bell, he not only made the Denver Broncos as an undrafted free agent, he started that year. He was their starting running back by the end of camp. So I thought, okay, so I want to be able to study players that cuts through all the narrative, because obviously people watch the game differently. There are people in our NFL draft circles that are big media names who I'm not going to mention by name because I'm not trying to attack them. What I'm trying to do is be realistic. There are different ways that people study. If you're studying 800 players over the span of a year, you cannot realistically look at them in detail every single one of them. You just can't. You won't be alive. It just because you wouldn't be able to sleep. And as someone who people say that about me looking at 150 players, I know that's true. So they study a different level of that. Now they know things about these guys, like they know all the narratives. And it's entertainment. Part of that's entertainment. They know that they're entertaining. Like their job is to provide the soap opera of like, well, this player, could he be the Heisman Trophy winner? And what is the Heisman? And he's on the ascent, and he's transferred here, and his story is really fascinating. And then the media feeds off of that, and it gets viewers, and that's the surface level. Now, doesn't mean they don't know the deep end of the craft. They had to get there, but they also have other demands. Someone like me, I was like, can I build a business where I know I'm not going to have a face for TV? I know I'm not going to be young enough by the time I know this for them to want me on the air. And can I do it in a way where that I can use my irascible personality in to my benefit as opposed to that? And what I could do is to just say, I study the tape. So a guy like Skylar Thompson, when I watch him, if he grades out well on film, that's great, because now I have a pre-draft version that says this is based on talent. This isn't based on character. It's not based on, there's some injury stuff that I put in there. But other than that, I'm not looking at anything other than what I see on film. And that way I can give you the goods of that. And then in the post-draft version that I put out a week after the NFL draft, that's part of this draft package, then I can look at draft capital, look at the roster fit and things like that. So Thompson wasn't my number one quarterback overall after the draft, but he stayed high enough, because when I watched him, what I saw was, high-end accuracy, layering throws, good work being able to work manage the pocket, great work managing the pocket, and consistently doing that over game after game after game. And I have the luxury now. I didn't have it before. It's still hard. Because when I grade that, to be like as blunt as possible, after I watched like 4 or 5 games, and I knew he was going to have a pretty good grade, even though I started looking around after that because I hadn't heard anybody talking about him. And I usually don't pay attention until like later on, because I just want to know what's coming for me in terms of like public response when I post some of these guys, because I know,
I get that.
and that's okay. But I want to know, at least I want to be somewhat prepared. I remember grading him, and I looked at the grade and I was like, oh, me, because this guy's going to be like, he's by far and away the top guy on my board. And so then I called up some people I know, like Chad Ryder, and I called up Russ Landy, and who's the head of NFL scouting or U.S. scouting for the Alouettes and a former scout, and called up some other people I can't mention by name, who are in scouting circles, and just said, I really like this Skylar Thompson. In fact, I like him probably better than anybody. And I heard it was interesting. Some of them were like, well, I'm going to watch because I know you, so I want to watch this guy now. I had one person range from like, oh man, like that's awful. And then I had somebody else. But then what was interesting is that there were 2 scouts, and then Russ and a couple other people who were like, I get it. I like him. And then there are a couple other people who were like, I talked to some other scouts about him, and they said, they have him much higher than what the board has to say. And somebody else I know told me that a head of an analytics group, or head of analytics for a major college football team, had him number 1 overall on his board as well,
really?
Which was fascinating because we came from completely divergent ways of looking at it. So when it comes to that, but I've had the luxury of, or maybe not the luxury, I've earned over the years having different takes with people, and knowing that it's hard to deal with early on when someone, when you have Nick Chubb number 1 over Saquon Barkley by a hair, and people are looking at you in the first months of the preseason, and having people calling you out and saying all sorts of things. And then literally and I've had this happen, which is unbelievable, but I've had people who've done that literally apologize to me equally publicly and say, I'm subscribing to you now because of this. And the joke's been now that like how do you become an RSP subscriber? The first step is to think I'm nuts and think I suck at what I do. And then the second step is to watch and see what happens. And then the third step is to go, oh, okay, maybe I should check this out. And then they become lifetime subscribers. So that's kind of that's my joke. That's kind of my little joke with it.
Yeah, it works.
Matt, he has a question for somebody. He calls up like actual NFL scouts and everything. I'm like watching Purdue film and I'm calling Nate at 10:30 at night, like, yo, Payne Durham, man, he's going to be something.
To be fair, Mike called me 2 years ago and said Payne Durham's going to be something. I just laughed at him. And now he's actually someone that we're going to scout this year.
See, there you go. And that's awesome. And that's part of the process because I didn't know anybody either. I mean, like what Russ Landy says is this. It's hard. We know it's very hard to be an NFL player. It's unbelievably hard to become one because it's the, top 1% to 3% who actually become starters in the league or major contributors out of all football players that have played the game. Well, apparently, statistically, it's harder to become an NFL scout than it is to become an NFL player, and it's harder to become a media scout than it is to become an NFL scout, at least from the odds standpoint. I haven't looked into that, but that's what Russ Landy says, and he teaches scouting and has been a scout. So I'll lean on him because I trust him on that level for sure.
Matt, I have based my scouting concept in the same way, where when I grade a player, and Mike will back this up, and he's laughed at me many times because of some of my rankings, but the film grade is what I have. And I have my film grade outside of any narrative, outside of any draft capital. And then when we get to actually fantasy football, before the NFL draft last year, or 2 years ago, I had Puka Williams as my RB5. I thought his vision and patience were great. I loved what he did behind the line of scrimmage, but he was also super skinny and small and only had 9 toes. So it was going against him. And he was obviously undrafted and barely even made it on the Bengals squad. But, I still believe that he looked good on film. As soon as he was undrafted, and even before that, I knew he probably was going to be undrafted. I'm not going to draft this guy in my rookie drafts, my Dynasty League first round. But I still believe that there's talent. And I know a couple years ago, I knew that you were a real big fan of Tyson Williams. And we liked Tyson Williams as well. We liked him a good bit, not quite as much as you, but we liked him too. And he ended up playing for my Ravens and, looking decent outside of just he couldn't get out of John Harbaugh's doghouse.
Well, it's fascinating how that works. And part of it too is I think the root thing for anybody who wants to scout is that it's really good to ignore what other people are doing throughout your process because you don't know their process. They'll share you. They're going to share you the tip of the iceberg, but you're not going to have no site other than outside of their own is going to show you everything that they do. And they may not want to show you everything that they do but it's just, some of it's boring. Some of it's just, it doesn't fit what they're about. But here's the thing. You're not going to learn how to do this without making mistakes. And you want to know what your mistakes were. And the only way to do that is to hold on to the things that you did and base it on that. Because otherwise, if you're like listening to Lance Zierlein one year and you're both wrong about one player and you listen to me the next and we're both wrong about that player, well, Lance and I might have completely different ways of looking at that position, and you have no idea where you went wrong. But if you have your own way, you can look at that and look back at several players. That's how it really should work, is that you look back at several players and go, I'm consistently getting this wrong. I'm consistent. This is an area that I see that was very clear that I just don't grade right or didn't see with the full amount of information and perspective that I needed. So that's extremely important. But yeah, I mean, and there's things that happen to players that you can't control. So there are going to be times where maybe everyone will tell you were wrong about this player. But if you watch them and you know that your process has been right about these things with players for years, but the player himself looked and he fit into that, but it's not showing up. It showed up on tape, but then maybe something else was going on. You can't control that. So Tyson Williams is a great example because Tyson Williams looked like the Tyson Williams I watched, who was, I think, my number 8 or number 9 running back that year as an undrafted free agent. When he got the starting gig because of the 2 injuries to Dobbins and to Edwards, Harbaugh was like, you're my, I love watching you run. I heard him say that, him coming off the field. First game against the Raiders, first half, he looked like Tyson Williams. The second half, he looked like a back who was afraid not to fumble. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of an interesting thing, just a little interesting story. As I asked Russ Landy about that on air a few months ago and brought him up because I was like, he's a good example of a player who just looked like something happened. He lost confidence. He started running scared and very cautious and overthinking everything. And Russ said, he goes, well, we can't say this for sure, but this is something I've observed a lot, is that when rookies get an opportunity to start, sometimes they're also on the same depth chart with veterans. And those veterans who are brought in due to injury are usually on 1-year contracts. And they are usually former starters with a high rate of pay as their minimum, who would like to keep their paycheck. And the only way they're going to keep their paycheck, probably, if there's two of them, say Devonta Freeman and Latavius Murray, is one of them's probably going to get to really be the starter, because they're not going to put the other one on special teams. They probably haven't played special teams in years, but Tyson Williams has, or would have to, and they would be okay with that because he's cheap. So if you're a veteran and you're watching this rookie have the starting gig and he's starting to play well, and you want to make sure you're on that team, he said, one thing I've seen veterans do, and we always hear about the veterans who help the rookies, okay? What we don't always hear of is the veterans who say, hey, kid, come here, let me tell you something. Man, you're playing great in this first half, and it's awesome, but just trust me, I want to help you with this, but I've been doing this for 12 years or 8 years or 10 years. Make sure you hold on to that ball in the second half, because if you fumble, your ass is going to get cut. You are not, you will not see the light of day. I know what the coaches are telling you, but trust me, I've seen guys come and go out of this league, and, I'm one of you, and they will do that. And I'm not saying they did that with Tyson Williams, because I have no proof of that, but Russ was saying that he's seen that played out. And and I could see a path of where Tyson Williams completely lost his confidence, because it was like night and day from the first half to the second half. And when you start making mistakes on top of it and playing cautious, and each thing starts to landslide, suddenly those coaches who look at you and go, see, he's under the lights, and now that we've got the real games going, he can't do it. And now he's bounced around the league. And that kind of thing does happen.
It just goes to show how multifaceted football is. And talent can mean the world, but it's got to be the right situation, good coaching, chemistry just within the players. There's so many different things, and we can only scout so many of those things without being in the room and interviewing those players and talking to the coaches. We're just watching film.
Yeah, and that's why at the end of the day, that's why I love to, with my pre-draft guide, I can just study film and say, listen, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, Raheem Mostert's case, even though I didn't study him, 7 years down the line, you might have a guy who literally comes up on your waiver wire because he's starting to play well, and you can go back and look and see what was studied about him that had nothing to do with the narrative. What did he do well? That way you can, when you rank, because rankings, to me, I hate rankings. So when you look at them, you can look at it and go, I remember ranking David Johnson 9th on my board. But I wrote in there, I said, listen, he's ranked 9th, but if he, most of the schemes are zone running schemes. So in the NFL at this point, if he finds a gap scheme, which means if he lands in Indianapolis or Arizona, he could be a Pro Bowl player and be at the top of this board. He just has to have the right fit. To me, that's way more valuable than, you put David Johnson 9th. Yeah. That's, and so, or if your grade of the 9th rated player is as high as players that you graded, in the last year's class, he would have been, if you just stuck him in that last year's class, he might have been number 3. Well, that tells you that, look at 2017's running back class. There's 14 players I listed on Twitter today who were like good, like at least good. And 11 of them are still playing at a high level right now, either as high-end backups. The lowest guy is Samaje Perine on that list. He's the worst guy on the list of 11 right now. And that's not to count Chris Carson, who's out, or Marlon Mack, who's still, had that AC, that Achilles injury, Tariq Cohen, who had two knee injuries.
Sad story.
Yeah, but there were so many other guys. So if you took somebody from that list, you took Jamal Williams and put him in this class with what he's done, you might not say he's a special back, but you go, he's a good prospect. You would have liked him as a prospect based on what you know about him now. So those things are important because what I have fantasy players every year, they're always like, can I just get the post-draft of what you do? Because you want to look at the narrative and the fit and all that. And I go, I know that's the most valuable thing to you, but in the long run, you're going to like the pre-draft more because in a year or two, when you've forgotten all about my post-draft rankings, or there's like 5 players who nobody cared about, suddenly 2 or 3 of them in week 8 or week 7 start to play well. And you go, who is this guy? And you go and look it back up and go, oh, this guy's got a good fit here. And they think he's pretty good. And he might help you maintain a winning record for 3 or 4 weeks. And now you're a number 1 seed in your playoffs. Or now they're going to him in the playoffs because he's going to be their starter as the team is, dealing with somebody else. And now you've made a pivotal difference with your team, even though he wasn't a guy you drafted early in your rookie draft or in the first 3 or 4 rounds. So that's where the value often comes in. And it comes in NFL scouting the same way. I mean, whoever picked up Raheem Mostert was probably like, we see something in that guy. I know he's bounced to 7 teams, but obviously there's something there. Or we remember scouting him 7 years ago. At the very least, we know he can be special teams for us. And at worst, he fits into our system with what we like. If we have to give him a shot, we can lean on that because we have to scout players who can do multiple things. And that paid off handsomely for the 49ers for a stretch.
Matt, before we get out of here, just one last question. I'll just combine these into the one. So what are some rookie red flags, just things that stand out to you as I'm off of this player? No, thank you. And, what are some mistakes that you make when you're scouting players as well?
Sure. Well, with red flags, some things like for quarterback, if a player completely turtles under pressure that's not there, like literally drops their eyes, drops their shoulders, completely looks like they're encasing themselves to prepare for a hit that never arrives or doesn't arrive for another second because they perceive pressure to be there, that would be a killer. That would be one where
watching Travis Etienne film, did you recognize that a lot of times he would kind of spin away from contact?
Yeah, sure. You know, like for me, that I know there are a lot of people who, if they put their back into contact, that's usually a killer. I don't necessarily subscribe to that as much because if you have a space player, you can fit the guy into space and say, all right, a lot of what the NFL's doing, you're fine. But for that wide receiver tracking the football, if a player can't track the ball over his head and isn't able to do that, that can be a killer. Sammy Coates is a good example of a player who had real trouble with doing that. You want to see guys who track well, or do they have to leave their feet every time a ball is at their chest or above? Do they extend their hands first before they leave their feet? That's usually a sign of a tracking issue. Some things that I have often made mistakes when scouting players. I mean, over the years, for me, some of the things would include not giving, I had to learn a lot more about release footwork and release handwork and certain aspects of route running skills. So early on, I often made mistakes of looking at highlight worthy catches and having more weight on like the catch point than I did on the actual technical skills to get open. So putting more weight into the mechanics of route running was important for me. Another was you can also put too much weight into smaller things. And those are things I've had to learn from, which is like, there are a lot of people who are great evaluators on Twitter in the public space who, if they have a coaching background, for instance, or an X's and O's background, and they'll either, what can happen is that, and I've been guilty of this part of it, is where you see players who don't aesthetically make the best decisions as running backs increases. Guys like Etienne or guys like Miles Sanders or players like Tevin Coleman. And while I wouldn't be necessarily say they can't play, I didn't judge the fact that what they do well can fit in the NFL in the right system and give them high level production. They didn't have to be Frank Gore as a decision maker to be good in the league. They could be far less than that. It's kind of like saying, I put it this way. The best analogy for it would be this. You have pop musicians and then you have jazz musicians. And there are a lot of jazz musicians who are studio musicians who can play any kind of music that's out there. And they're often playing in the studio for these pop musicians who, from a knowledge base standpoint, they know this much in their pinky compared to what the musician who's backing them up knows in their hand. But it doesn't mean that they still can't produce a great product, even if it's with the help of so many other different facets like marketing, their looks, the right type of song written for them, the charisma that they project on stage, and then a great band backing them up that can probably play a lot more than what they're doing with these 3-chord type of things with a drum track beat. Well, Tevin Coleman to me is an example of, I'll say it's like someone like Taylor Swift. He's like the Taylor Swift of of running backs at the time when he was in Atlanta. Doesn't mean that he's a bad player. It just means that relative to Frank Gore, he knows a lot less than than a guy like Gore, who Gore would be more of like the Thelonious Monk of running backs, or somebody like that. So it's a different story.
All right, don't hate on Taylor Swift though. I'm not about that.
I'm not a Taylor Swift fan. I'm sorry. Not my cup of tea.
I don't listen to her, but I mean, I respect the fact that she's done as well as she has. That's for sure.
She is fairly local to where I live. She's from Bucks County, so
there you go. There you go.
She actually writes her own songs, unlike a lot of the other pop stars.
Sure.
I do have a lot of respect for that, though. I love musicians that write their own music, obviously, and I love analysts that will stick to their own takes. And
there you go. Matt,
that's one of the things that we respect about you, to be honest with you. You have your process, you stick to it, but you're not afraid to admit when you're wrong. Same as us. So we got a lot in common there. So Matt, before we head out, I want to say thank you again. Why don't you tell us what you got going on? Promo your podcast. Promo everything you want the people to hear about.
Well, let's start with the RSP film room on YouTube. It's one of the longer running film rooms that are out there. I probably have over 600 pieces of videos up there where from short form to long form, I'll watch with different people. Sometimes I'll just do my own type of work there, but you'll get examples of how I scout players and what it is I'm looking for. And I even have a growing video glossary that will be showing up on every criteria point that I study these positions on. You'll have video examples. I appreciate that because that's new, and I even have that in podcast form at my site, www.mattwaldmanrsp.com. So that'll be growing. On top of that, the RSP cast itself, every Monday, I do a fantasy show with Bob Harris, the great Bob Harris, called Feel It or Fuck It.
We've had Bob Harris on the show before.
Bob awesome.
Is my dude. He's great.
Me too. He's one of my good friends in this industry, and he was someone I looked up to getting into this. So it's fun because I look older than he does, but he's older than me. So, but that's my dig at him. But we do that. I do a show with Felix Sharp of Campus to Canton every other week.
I love Felix.
Yeah, Felix
love
is
those
awesome.
guys over there.
Yeah, he's awesome. So we talk about he gives more the narrative and the things that are going on with the players that I'm about to watch maybe in a year or two. So a lot of my listeners can kind of stay up to date with that. And then I give scouting reports on some players of what I've been watching. Russell Andy and I do an every other week show on just the nuts and bolts of scouting, front office management, the business side of the NFL from the standpoint of personnel decisions with players, not contract stuff, just really nuts and bolts of like player techniques and some things that we like watching with these players and what we're thinking about these players as time goes on. Lori Fitzpatrick of TD Wire, she and I do an NFL show every other week. Adam Harstead of Football Guys, he and I do a film and data show, something that Dwayne McFarland and I used to do together. Now it's Adam, but Adam's more theory based. So it's more like practice and theory, I would say, is probably more what it's like for Dynasty. And Adam's just fantastic. So that's my lineup every week for the RSP cast. You can find on any outlet. And then, of course, there's the rookie scouting portfolio, and it is available for pre-order. It's available for $21.95, and it'll be available April 1st, like it has been for the past 18 years. And you get you get a pre-draft and post-draft with it. The pre-draft gives you rankings. It gives you rankings on at least 150 players at the skill positions, complete breakdowns. It takes you through all the criteria we've been discussing today. You even get a chance to see it in a glossary, but it also takes you through kind of breakdowns in an entertaining fashion of like facets of games where they stack ranking against each other, thoughts in the beginning of the chapter on each position in their draft history, and then really in-depth profiles on these players, as well as cheat sheet rankings. So you can just get the highlights if you want to look at the cheat sheets. And then the post-draft gives you positional fit based on the depth chart that they're with and some contract values or contracts of players, so that you can see, all right, well, this guy is probably going to be third on the depth chart, but the two players ahead of him have 1 and 2 years left on their contract. So maybe he's got a chance here, and talk about what I think about those players. And in addition to good fits and bad fit studies, and then a cheat sheet that is literally my re-ranking of the player based temporarily on their fit and talent versus where I've studied the ADP of drafts just after the NFL draft. And I give you a comparison. So for instance, if I like Patrick Mahomes a lot more than maybe the consensus, but I wasn't saying draft him 1.01, the ADP says you could probably draft him at 25. So why not draft him at 17 or 18 or 19 and get the extra player? So I'd show you those sweet spots of how to get players. You get a newsletter with it that comes June through December, previewing the next year's class occasionally, as well as commentary on the rookies of this year's class and updated rankings for the past 3 years. And that's all available for $21.95 at mattwaldman.com. And a percentage of that, a portion of the proceeds now, up to $5,000 goes to an organization called Darkness to Light. D2L.org. They're an organization devoted to preventing sexual abuse of children through educational programs in the public. They were at Penn State, and that was great at Penn State to be able to do that and to get, someone to be able to do with that training. Michigan State, I think they've done some work with them as well. They teach adults on not only how to prevent abuse, but also how to handle it, because it's a common problem. There are people who denigrated Penn State over the issue that they did, and understandable that, they took some criticism, but it's a societal problem because even individuals, when they're trying to help someone who's been victimized, don't know how to do it and can inflict more trauma as a result of it because they don't know how to handle it. So they train people on how to do that, individuals to civic groups to universities, anybody. And we've given over $55,000 on behalf of the RSP to this organization since 2012.
Wow, that's awesome.
That's amazing. That's great. I'm on mattwaldman.com right now. I will be pre-ordering my RSP.
Thank you.
I just have to go get my wallet so I can do that. But Matt, thank you again for coming on and hanging out with us. You could find Matt Waldman on Twitter at Matt Waldman. Easy enough. So it was great. Do you have anything else you want to say before we head out?
Just thank you very much for having me on, and it's fun to be able to just talk about process and things like that, and not just players. But I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys think about some of these players, and we'll catch up down the line.